Hi, my name's Ian Wallace. I call myself the Messed Up Counsellor, which is quite an intriguing name. And the podcast you're about to see is one of many, and we've been doing about a year now. So you can look back and see all the things we've talked about with guests and on my own over the process. A lot of the information I use in the podcast initially came from the first book I wrote in 2011. Why do we do that? What do we do about it? And that came out and was the basis of all my learning, understanding at that time, which is going back a few years now. And that process of understanding how the world works for people, how we can alter, change, and adapt it, was kind of what it was there to do with the initial stages. I've made that now an audiobook as well, so it's available on Amazon as an audio file that you can check out and you can download to your heart's content, and hopefully that will be helpful. In the podcasts, we're trying to look at all sorts of things about human interactions, human dynamics, the world, and how we might understand it more or change it more. So it gives you lots of ideas and tools in order to think about and look at different ways of being or dealing with things. And hopefully that brings people together and makes people more able to connect and communicate. Lots of topics. If you ever want to connect to me, just obviously drop me a comment on the podcast and I shall try as much as possible to reply. And if you've got any ideas of things that we might want to use on the podcasts, then please let me know. My name's Ian Wallace. Thanks for looking and thanks for listening. Hi, and welcome to another podcast by Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. Today, what I'd like to look at and have a conversation about is something that I find creates a lot of confusion in my world, working with people with communication. And that's intergenerational communication. Now, what I mean with that is kind of like people that are in different generations. So you might have a parent talking to a child or parent talking to a grandmother or those kind of things, where they're kind of like into a different time zone with their language, their communication, their culture, everything. When we're conversing, when we're communicating with people from different generations, we only can use our understanding of the world, as we do with everything. So if I'm talking to a young person, for example, a teenager, then my instant kind of reference point as a dad, as a father, would be to look at how I see that age, that reference point of if that it was a 16-year-old, for example. So I use my age at 16 to kind of work out what it is that they are interested in, how they communicate, how they live their world and their life. We can only do that. We can only see the world from our own reference points. And we take that as being the way it works, quite naturally, which is not usually true, to be fair. So when I'm working, the kind of development that we go through as counsellors is not to look within our own, we call them lenses, so our own eyes of experience, but try to look at many lenses. So when we're becoming more developed, more experienced as counsellors, we will be working with different people at different ages in different ways, quite naturally. So from that point of view, we've got a wider lens to pick up all that information from. So instead of using our own frame of reference, we will use our experiential frame of references to understand how to look at their world. So we might be able to say to a parental figure in the room, okay, so, your 16-year-old might be looking at the process of their world and see a lot of insecurity. And the parental figure might say, what do you mean insecurity? We we're both together, we've got a strong marriage, we've got a strong relationship, the family's good. I say, yes, that's true. The world of that 16-year-old doesn't revolve purely and simply in your world. It resolves in other worlds, their schoolwork, their school friends, their experiences outside of the family unit, and they are drawing on those life experiences to understand their world. So if you imagine that you, as a, say, 50-year-old parent, is trying to look at a 16-year-old person's world, what are you using to understand that world from? How are you defining that world? How are you getting any understanding, knowledge, or awareness of it? And those kind of conversations can be really helpful and meaningful, because as a 16-year-old in this day and age, there's a lot more pressure than there would be when that 50-year-old was 16, quite naturally. So there's a lot more pressure around exams and careers and looking at the relationship with their friends. They're much more intense, probably, with Facebook and TikTok and WhatsApp and all these kind of things, than that 16-year-old probably is bombarded 24 hours a day, pretty much, with information from these external sources. The 50-year-old might never have had that as a 16-year-old because it just wasn't there at that time. So there's going to be a lot of differences between those two worlds of a 16-year-old and a 50-year-old who used to be 16 at some point. So bringing those different lenses in, those different ways of looking at the world, can help that 50-year-old be much more inquisitive, much more wondering about that 16-year-old's world, and have conversations with the 16-year-old, because I, as a 68-year-old counsellor, will never be able to understand that 16-year-old's world. Obviously, I'm not the 16-year-old. But I can probably get more opportunities of having different experiential interactions with younger people to give slightly more modified, more centralised process of looking at their world. So the best way to understand the 16-year-old world is obviously to talk to them, ask them about their world. The problem with that is how we communicate. So the 50-year-old might communicate with the 16-year-old with, how's your day been? Now that 16-year-old is probably not used to having conversations with the 50-year-old parent, so they'll probably say, yeah, fine, all right, okay. And there'll be one-word answers or very limited conversation. So that's not going to give that 50-year-old parental figure many ideas about what's happening with that 16-year-old's world, as you can imagine. So we have to use a different style of language. We have to use a different process to engage with that conversation. So we have to look at opening up the conversation with different connections, different words, different communication. So we might want to talk about, okay, not how's your day been? That might be too direct. You might want to say, what did you do today? So although that's a better opportunity, it's not necessarily going to give you the answer, yeah, but it's opening up that dialogue in a different way. So what have you done today is a much better process of connection, of conversation, that how's your day been? Because how's your day been is kind of going one-way traffic. Yeah. What have you done today? It gives an opportunity of two-way traffic, conversation, words. So we have to readjust how we speak. We have to readjust how we work. And we have to try not to give that young person an understanding that we know just because we've been 16, because it will not be the same. Some things will be the same, obviously, but there's going to be a lot of stuff that isn't. And if we're inquisitive, if we're wondering, if we're checking out, then they can give us much more about their world. You get the same process happening the other way. So if you've got a parental figure that's, say, 80, and you're a 24, 25-year-old, then that generational aspect coming down and going up is going to be different again, quite naturally. So if we want to engage with that person, conversation, then we need to make them aware that we're not a threat in our conversation. We don't necessarily have all the answers. We don't have all the understanding. So we might be saying, or we might be having conversations from the 80-year-old to the mid-20s-year-old, and they may have just got a new child, baby. So the 80-year-old has been a mum, obviously, because that's your mother, or your mother-in-law. So that process means that they've had experience of being a mum. But as most new mums will know, that process won't be the same, quite naturally. There'll be some things the same, i.e. you're having a child, you've got responsibilities. But how you now look after that child, what you do with that child, how that child develops, there's a lot more understanding nowadays about children and development than there ever was. Much more understanding about what is the easiest way to develop and grow and become. And a lot more studies, a lot more information than they ever used to be. So if that's a brand new grandchild for the family, then that 80-year-old is going to use their frame of reference to understand what it's like to be a mum, quite naturally. So then we need to open up a dialogue with them, because communication is about getting both people to be able to communicate more effectively with respect and with valuing and all the rest of the stuff that we try and do with communication. So we need to give them their seniority, their position of respect, because they've been here a lot longer than us, but in a way that doesn't necessarily make them feel as though it's a battle. So they may come in with ideas of, I don't know, how to feed a child, at what stage they should have solid food. Those things will have changed over the years. So they've got their frame of reference, you've got your frame of reference. Yours is your child, so it's obviously a lot more personal to you, and you're probably more open to research and finding out and all those kind of things about child development and eating and the stages of development. So we need to give that older person understanding that we're not blocking them off and saying, you don't know what you're on about. And we're giving them respect and value. But we're giving them respect and value in a way that opens up a dialogue, opens up that conversation to have some kind of interactive process of discovery. So if you say to them, if they say, well, okay, you need to feed them 16 months solid food. Now, that might have changed. It might be 8 months now, as a example. I don't know if that's true. Then if they're saying that that is what you need to do and you say, no, you don't, you're going to lead that process into a disconnection. There's going to be a falling out communication-wise. If you say, well, the current research is this, and this is the way people do it, then you're using a much wider frame of reference to not kind of accuse the older person of not knowing what they're on about, but by having an opener conversation about it and bringing their ideas in and your ideas in to have some sharing of those ideas and those processes. So when we're looking at intergenerational conversations, we all take the view that our eyes, our lens, is the way it is for everybody else, as I've said. So having that opening conversation of saying, well, actually, I don't know it all. There may be things that you can tell me about your world because I don't know your world. That honesty can be a lot easier. When I'm working with parents who are having teenagers for the first time, the Kevin syndrome, as I call it, and if anybody's watched Kevin and Perry, you'll understand what I mean. That they get to 13 and suddenly change into this stroppy kind of person. We all do that to a certain degree. That's no criticism, it's just part of development. So as we're doing that process, then parents are trying to understand that teenager. I'll say to them, okay, so just kind of on paper, don't try and do it in your head, because in your head you can move things around. You can lose things in your head. But if you write things down, it makes them real. I'll say, okay, so what do you think your concerns were as a teenager? And what do you think your fears, worries were? And I get them to realise that time again. Now, we've gone through that time. Obviously, we're a mid-40s, mid-50s person, age-wise. So we don't normally think back. We don't normally analyse. We just assume it's the same for everybody. So having that conversation and writing those things down, fears, worries and concerns, there will be some that's similar, naturally, but there'll be some that aren't the same. And then with that young person, I get them to do exactly the same process. What's your fears, worries and concerns about your world now, today, as you're moving through these time periods? And then I get both people to have a look at them. And there will be some similarities, yes, obviously, but there'll be a lot of things that are different. And because they've written them down, hopefully being honest, then we can open up a dialogue. We can open up a conversation about the differences, about the reality of each other's worlds. Now, the parental fears, worries and concerns will be different to the young person's, quite naturally, because they're parents, they look after, they keep safe, they are worried about all sorts of things, about going out on a night, about knife attacks that's in the news and things. So there'll be a whole range of different worries and concerns that the parental figure will have that the young person probably haven't thought about because it's not their frame of reference. And then opening up that dialogue can be helpful. So whether or not you're looking at an older person to understand, so parents to grandparents kind of thing, or if you're looking at going down the generations from parents to children or young people, having those kind of conversations with them individually, not as a group usually. Individual is easier. It's less challenging. Then we can open up that dialogue and we can see how each person kind of sees it. And because we're writing it down, we're not talking about it, then we won't necessarily feel uncomfortable or it won't necessarily become an emotional conversation, which might bring in arguments or disagreements. Because each person is having their space and time to think about it and to write it down and to reflect on it. So it's not in the moment. If you try and ask those questions in the moment, it will normally not go too well. Certainly if there's already conflict in the relationship between the two people. So we're getting both people, the parents, the young people, the parents and the grandparents, whoever they are, to have that conversation with themselves, i.e. writing it down, and then having the conversation with the other person and swapping notes, for want of a better word. And then we can look at the individualities of them. We can look at the shared processes and we can look at the different processes. And each person that's a teenager will have a different view on that. As I said, there will be some similarities, but they won't be the same. You could have twins in a family and there may be 3 minutes, 4 minutes difference on birth. They will look at the world differently. They will not look at it the same. So if you're a parent trying to understand a teenager's world and there's 2 teenagers with a year apart or even 4 minutes apart, don't automatically assume they're going to see it the same way, because they won't. They will have had different experiences. They'll have brought different ideas to that process, different educational learning processes, and they will have formed their own unique understanding of the world. There will be some similarities, as I've said, but they will not be exactly the same. So it's about treating each person as an individual. It's about sharing those ideas. And it's about using language that other people understand. When I'm working with young people nowadays, some of the language they use, which is their cultural language, quite naturally, um, I don't understand what it is they're saying. And that's not in any way, shape, or form a criticism. That's just different cultural, generational processes. So I have to ask what they mean by it, because their understanding of it and mine might be completely different. It's the old thing about being, sick. It's sick, a young person might say. I don't know if that's the current terminology. It might not be. But if it was, then my understanding of it's sick might mean that, oh my God, let me go and get an ambulance or a doctor or something like that. For that young person, as far as I know, which might be different now, as I've said, because things change so quickly, it might be, it's great, it's fantastic, So although we are using the same word, it may not be the same meaning. So it's about opening up that conversation, finding the language, finding what it is they mean, and don't automatically assume you know what they mean, because it might be completely different. Things change within a very short space of time nowadays, to be fair. Language changes. Every year the dictionary brings out the words that are now acceptable that's come up in the last year. And it's very interesting sometimes, because some of the words I've never even heard, which is quite unusual for a counsellor. But that process means the language is changing, the cultural references are changing. And unless we have the same language with the same meaning, we can't communicate. Nowadays, with Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, all these kind of media processes, cultural identity goes much quicker. It changes much faster than it used to, certainly in my day. And that cultural language, you can change it within a couple of 3 years. So even if you've got two young people, they might not be speaking the same language. So don't automatically assume the conversation you're having with one young person is going to use the same frame of reference with the other. If there's something that doesn't seem right, it doesn't fit, then open it up as dialogue and say, well, okay, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by sick? Well, sick's great, sick's wonderful. Ah, right, okay. So I don't need to call an ambulance. I don't need to go to get you to the doctor. Because those kind of frames of references need to be understood, need to be worked and connected to with shared understanding of what it means. So when you talk about intergenerational communication and differences and fallouts, most of it is because we don't look at things in the same way. Most of it isn't because we want to be awkward or we want to be disrespectful. It's just we're using a frame of reference that is not the same from the same point. So it's a bit like somebody speaking French and trying to engage in a conversation with somebody who speaks Italian. Now, if they have no comprehension of the other person's language, it is not going to go far. It's not going to get a shared process. So in some senses, counsellors, therapists, we're kind of the people who get people to understand each other's language. We become the interpreter. And that can be really helpful sometimes. And certainly intergenerational, it can, to get people to be able to talk, to share ideas, to share views, and to tell each other how their worlds are. Most of the time when it goes wrong, communication, or misunderstanding, or miscommunication, then it's about neither one knowing what the other one really means, or they're not saying, talking, sharing what the other one means. So when you're thinking about that language, when you're thinking about how can I have that conversation, don't automatically assume that your world is the right world. Be open to the ideas that your world might not be the right world nowadays. And that person, young person, old person, they're living in a different world to you, which is a bit strange sometimes. But hopefully that will help you to have that more open conversations. Hopefully it will help you to have that dialogue. Because without communication, effective communication, nothing works. The whole world stops. So have good conversations. Have open conversations. Listen and ask. Don't tell. And then hopefully it'll work a bit easier. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care. Hi, thanks for listening to the podcast, and hopefully it made sense and was interesting for you. Please subscribe, like, and share. With the podcasts, you never know who will be helped by the things we talk about, things we share. We don't normally tell people our problems, but by sharing it and helping other people to understand things. The book Insecurity, It's All About Me, is also available now through Amazon. And it gives you an understanding of what drives insecurity, how insecurity works within our human dynamics, and how you can get a much more secure connection with people. It gives you lots of ideas and thoughts, which is really good. So thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, share, hit the button. And if you've got any comments, please give me them, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks very much. Take care.